They haven't started it yet. Maybe they haven't even made the final decision yet, but I think they have. John Deere is going to, and anybody else that does this, because it's hurting our farmers, it's hurting our manufacturing. And if you do.
When farmers are trapped between declining product prices and rising financing costs in the US, they resort to a model that focuses on maintenance and spare parts instead of newly built machines. This choice shortly protects the company's cash flow. In the long run, however, it leads to a problem with an aging fleet similar to that in the automotive industry. An aging fleet means more maintenance. If the maintenance of imports and metal products depends on it, the customs appear on the service bill. The slowdown in rural areas leads to production delays and market fluctuations. Let's simplify the functioning of the customs mechanism. If the US government issues an additional tax on a product or country, the manufacturer would like to pass this tax on to the sales price. However, if the demand on the domestic market is weak and market prices are under pressure, the possibility of passing the tax on is limited. Limited tax on a product or country means that part of the costs remain in the company's balance sheet. A manufacturer like John Deere has a different price transfer dynamic in its segments of agricultural machinery and construction machinery. The margins can rise in some segments depending on the industry cycle, while in others they remain low. If the margins do not rise, the capacity is reduced. Reduced capacities affect employment. If employment drops, unemployment affects the region. This leads to a weakening of the tax measurement basis and pressure on the state budget. From the perspective of practice, the language of finance is easier. When investing in agricultural machinery in the US, farmers take into account three key factors: the basic price of the equipment, the interest rate, and the lifetime maintenance costs for materials and spare parts. Taxes directly affect two of these three factors. The basic price rises with the raw materials and spare parts, and imports cause additional costs during each maintenance period. The interest rates depend on the macroeconomic conditions in the US. The US monetary authorities cannot act quickly. In such times, farmers repair old equipment and various new acquisitions, which disrupts the flow of orders into the factories. With spare parts, a similar picture arises. If there are delays in the flow of trade for imported components, such as warehouses, hydraulics, electronics, and microchips, waiting times affect the port docks and shifts of the shipment plan directly on the business plan. If international shipping traffic is overloaded, even the coordination between rail and road transport within the transport system is not sufficient to solve the problem. Port modernization, maritime trade efficiency, and the customs single window are crucial. Therefore, trade routes and port investments are the focus, even if it is about a collapse of rural areas. The market always calculates these invisible costs into the prices. Consumer prices are not limited only to individual trade labels, but also include the time the spare parts need to get from dock to factory service. The energy sector is the driving force behind this chain. These costs are linked to oil and oil refineries. Maintenance times of refineries, oil transport traffic on the seaway, and traffic jams at oil terminals increase the pressure on cargo and transport costs. The prices for natural gas and electricity affect the refrigeration and service logistics. Outages of the power grid disrupt the continuity of maintenance in rural areas. The stagnation of a mill during harvest time not only affects the food supply, but also the trade behavior on the market within the economy. The market quickly puts a risk premium on consumer prices. In contrast, investments in energy plants, access to liquid natural gas, and the refurbishment of oil pipelines reduce the transport costs. This partially mitigates the pressure on the margins of the industry. The supply chain is not only rewritten within the USA, but also along the corridors USA, Canada, and Mexico. As long as the USMCA framework remains in force, the opening of a flexible time window for port and shipping flows through Canada is a practical solution. The harmonization of customs regulations with the Mexican government on trade flows reduces customs disputes and shortens the waiting time for imported components. The document clearly states that EU legally prescribed procedures for trade with Europe reduce market uncertainty and guarantee supply with medical technology and electronics. Longer Asian-Pacific Indo-Pacific routes do not automatically mean higher costs. With clear development, these remain competitive. In an environment with persistent customs uncertainty, long-term contracts and predictable trading conditions are always drawn short distances with variable costs. In the short term, clear instruments are available to manufacturers. 1. increase of regional procurement of materials and reduction of import dependence on risky items. 2. Implementation of price stabilization and stock optimization for steel and aluminum on the raw material side. 3. Establishment of a circular economy model by renewal and reprocessing in the service and spare parts channel. The common goal of these three is to smooth the wave in trade relations without passing it on to companies. The third option is stronger in the long term as it protects the employment in the factory and in the industrial ecosystem and prevents employment shocks. In addition, simple but effective political options are available. The US government could introduce targeted exception regulations for agricultural machinery components. Tax receipts and accelerated deductions could support the company's investment cycle. While the state treasury would have to bring this in line with household discipline, the targeted use of household invoices could lead to significant savings in consumer prices. Simplification of guidelines for customs integration and the acceleration of claim procedures at customs fees also reduce import delays. Such procedures are often more effective than strike measures. With falling market uncertainty, prices come down. Trust is the most important asset in agricultural business traffic. Farmers want long-term service contracts for agricultural machinery, transparent prices for spare parts, and guaranteed delivery times from the factory. If producers provide this, it will be possible to overcome shocks in trade relations together. This partnership model distributes cost shocks for farmers, reduces the impact on the cash flow of producers, and lowers the risk premium on consumer prices for the economy. Extended lifespan via remanufacturing and certified spare parts. Fastest success in cyclical industries, especially with expensive import dependence. When it comes to food prices, equipment costs alone are not the determining factor. Food prices are influenced by energy goods such as oil and fertilizers, natural gas and electricity, transport and shipping costs, port delays and trade on the market. However, the increase in costs for agricultural machinery will increase production costs in the long term. The shipping traffic in Asia is dependent on channel water level fees and regional port capacity. The north-south equilibrium on these routes is not only a geopolitical but also an engineering and hydrometeorological problem. The share of Latin America in international shipping traffic fluctuates with bottlenecks in the canal and the efficiency of the Caribbean ports. Therefore, numerous investments in terminals and rail traffic connections on the continent serve as strategic insurance policies. While capacity is increasing in the Asian direction, the modernization of ports and the diversification of trade routes on the Atlantic side reduce overall costs. Raw material price cycles cannot be looked at separately from politics. Oil, natural gas, coal production, solar energy, and hydropower are directly affected by the cost for freight, fertilizers, and food. If energy is expensive, fertilizers are expensive. If fertilizers are expensive, agricultural production is weak. This chain is reflected in food prices and price pressure for consumers. China funded modernization of energy plants and refineries. The refurbishment of oil pipelines and the access to liquid natural gas not only regulate the costs of energy, but also the agricultural industry. Although such investments seem like political decisions, they lead to productivity increases in factories and on-site material supply, which ultimately reduces market volatility. Technology and automobiles will continue to heat up the debate in the short term. Under the keyword microchips and electric cars, Asian production creates a global supply triangle in combination with the inflow of nickel, cobalt, and lithium from Latin America for electric vehicles and batteries. Stopping car customs and import insecurity in the north consolidate the assembly and distribution flows along the Asia-Latin America axis, with potentially lasting changes for the global car industry. Regional governments are trying to align their local goals for car and truck production with the gigafactory plans of Asia. The goal is to develop from a raw material exporter to a host for factories and industries. This transformation requires money and patience. In return, it brings jobs and a technological foundation. Hard rhetoric in political communication is popular in the short term, but trade and supply chains prefer long-term approaches. The most rational approach for Latin America is a balance act over several channels. Contracts with Asia standards with Europe and optimized processes with the North. As soon as this three-tier equilibrium is established, the premiums for market uncertainty, the risk of household expenses and the pressure on the state treasury will decrease and employment will become more stable. The phrase that the influence of the USA is fading is therefore not just a political slogan. It is a practical result that will be visible in the triad of contracts and finances. Let's look at the next 6 months. First, when the scope of coordination on the Beijing line becomes clearer, the trade route to Asia will become permanent. Second, although the standards and regulatory obligations on the EU line for Latin America may appear more costly, the predictability they offer will be rewarded in market assessments. Third, frequent changes in US customs in the north will keep companies in a deterrent position and open opportunities for trade routes between Asia and Latin America. Fourth, if infrastructure, energy, and logistics investments are not carried out together, Beijing's backwardness could remain in administrative bottlenecks, which makes intra-regional coordination of crucial importance. Fifth, the legitimacy of domestic projects financed by China will be determined by household discipline and debt tolerance. With increasing transparency, political resistance will decrease. To sum up this overall picture in one sentence, the U.S. customs strategy urges the allies to set their course outside the negotiating table instead of keeping them at the negotiating table. Latin America's answer is not a passionate break, but a new equilibrium through technology and finances. Closer relations to Beijing mean cost reductions, shipping insurance investments, energy networks, and advantages for trade and ports. This may create a sense of surroundings in the short term, but in the medium term, it will be referred to as new corridors because containers are faster than politics. They are brought there where there is less uncertainty. In the last section, I would like to ask the audience 2 questions. Will Latin America reverse these new corridors without procedural clarity in the north? And will Beijing's Latin American backwardness become more permanent when standards and transparency conditions become stricter? Share your thoughts with us. This offers a real added value for decision makers in companies on site. If you sign up and activate notifications, you will still receive clear and precise insights into the effects on trade ports and consumer prices on the same day, as soon as new timetables and texts are announced. Il viaggio dentro la crisi dell'agricoltura americana ci porta a un punto di non ritorno. Abbiamo visto contadini costretti a rattoppare trattori vecchi di 20 anni, John Deere schiacciata tra margini in caduta e ricambi sempre più cari, rotte commerciali, bloccate da dogane e congestioni portuali, e un triangolo USA-Canada-Messico che vacilla di fronte alla sfida asiatica. Abbiamo assistito al peso dei dazi di Trump che hanno acceso un fuoco di corto respiro, ma rischiano di lasciare cenere a lungo termine. E soprattutto abbiamo scoperto quanto questa crisi non sia solo americana, ma globale, perché quando il cuore agricolo degli Stati Uniti rallenta il battito, si indebolisce anche nelle tavole d'Europa, nelle fattorie del Brasile, nei mercati asiatici. La verità è che il cibo è potere. E il potere si costruisce non solo con trattori e mieti trebbie, ma con energia, logistica e diplomazia. Oggi questi pilastri appaiono incrinati e il rischio è che l'intero sistema crolli come un domino. Non è un caso che gli analisti del Financial Times abbiano definito l'agricoltura americana una torre di Jenga, ogni dazio, ogni ritardo, ogni blackout è un mattoncino estratto. Prima o poi la torre potrebbe cadere. Gli scenari futuri aprono prospettive inquietanti. Se gli Stati Uniti non riusciranno a modernizzare rapidamente le proprie infrastrutture e a stabilizzare i rapporti commerciali, l'Asia e l'America Latina potrebbero approfittarne per consolidare nuove rotte. Pechino ha già dimostrato di saper tessere reti commerciali con velocità sorprendente. Il rischio è che il cibo, bene essenziale più prezioso del petrolio, diventi un terreno dove gli USA non dettano più le regole. E intanto dentro i confini americani cresce il malcontento sociale. I villaggi rurali si svuotano. I giovani abbandonano le campagne. Le officine chiudono. Una fotografia che ricorda la Detroit dell'industria automobilistica negli anni 2000. Ma qui l'oggetto della crisi non è l'auto e il pane. Un fallimento che colpirebbe non solo il portafoglio, ma la sopravvivenza stessa di milioni di persone. Ed è qui Ed è qui che la voce narrante si rivolge direttamente allo spettatore. Quanto ancora potrà resistere l'agricoltura americana prima che il sistema ceda definitivamente? Riuscirà John Deere a reinventarsi senza tradire la propria anima? O sarà travolta dalla tempesta globale? E soprattutto chi guiderà il futuro del cibo se non più gli Stati Uniti? Domande brucianti che lasciano aperto lo spazio al dibattito. Perché non esiste ancora una risposta definitiva, c'è solo un conto alla rovescia che scorre invisibile nei campi del Midwest e nei porti congestionati del Pacifico. Adesso tocca a voi. Qual è la vostra opinione? L'America agricola riuscirà a resistere o stiamo assistendo a un declino inevitabile? Scrivetelo nei commenti perché il vostro punto di vista conta. E se volete restare aggiornati sulle prossime analisi e sugli sviluppi che potrebbero cambiare la storia del cibo mondiale, iscrivetevi al canale e attivate le notifiche. La prossima mossa di Washington, di Pechino o di Bruxelles potrebbe arrivare domani e voi dovete essere pronti a conoscerla subito.